All right, let's get started. These lectures are each associated with one class session from your Biology 101 class. Today we're in session 8, which is on evolution. And so what happens is each week you have an opportunity to attend a lecture like this one to basically have a more traditional style classroom experience in your online class. Also each week, each of these lectures is recorded and posted online, so that if you can't make it here, you can see the exact same content online at some point. And so today's topic,
where can we see that?
Well, if you email me, I can send you a link. I don't have it available right now. It's this long. Well, you can't see it, but it's this long. So
okay.
we can get you there at some point if you email me. So what we will do now is go ahead and jump right into our content with our talk on evolution. And so you'll notice I have a quote up here that says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And that's a pretty bold statement to say that biology all hinges on evolution. However, it is such a critical concept because biology is the study of life. And the way living things got to be the way they are is through evolution. And so if you've ever had a little kid that want to play the why game, if you've seen that where little kids go like, well, why, again and again and again, trying to get you so that you don't have an answer. The nice thing about biology is that you can always have an answer. And that answer is because it evolved that way. And so today we're going to look at evolution. We'll concentrate on evolution by natural selection, and then after that we'll talk about a few other things that influence evolution. So today we'll talk about the three, and there's another one that I'm going to give you that's not really a requirement, but we'll talk about requirements for evolution by natural selection. And we're going to start off here with a couple definitions. Evolution is a genetic change in a population over time, so it's populations that evolve, and natural selection is the force that causes such a change. So I'm going to give you a very brief example starting here about the way this works genetically. If you remember back to the session on genetics, what we had genes and alleles. And alleles were multiple forms of those genes. And so let's say, for instance, there was a gene in squirrels that gave them a good memory. So the idea being we have a big M for good memory and a little m for bad memory. Our possible genotypes are then big M, big M, big M, and little m, little m. And if this follows classic Mendelian genetics with dominant recessive traits, these two would be good memory, and this one would be bad. And now let's say we take a population of squirrels, and we're just going to say we have 10 squirrels. Each of those 10 squirrels would have 2 chromosomes, and on each of those chromosomes, they would have one of the alleles. So although there's 10 squirrels, there's 20 total alleles in the population. And so what we can do is write down each of these alleles. So we could have some squirrels that were big M, and then we could have some that were heterozygous, and then we could have some that were recessive. Okay, and so what we have here is 3 homozygous dominants, 4 heterozygous, and 3 homozygous recessive. All right. Remember that we said evolution was simply a genetic change in the population. If we're talking about squirrel memory, let's say this memory is related to their ability to remember where they buried nuts. What you could imagine happening is that some of these individuals will do better than others. And these with the better memory will probably do better. Right now, in our population, we have 50% of the dominant allele and 50% of the recessive allele. But what's going to happen is that if these guys forget where they stored their seeds, they might starve to death, and we might lose some of these from the population. And that's it. That was evolution right there. What we've done is we've changed the allele frequencies in the population these are no longer 50-50. Relatively speaking, the number of big M's has gone up and the number of little m's has gone down. And so, from a genetic standpoint, evolution is a change in this allele frequency in the population. But no, today we're talking about evolution by natural selection. Natural selection was the force that acted to remove these two guys right here. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to keep that in mind as we journey through the rest of this presentation today. That it's that simple. And the key is, evolution changes the genotype and therefore the phenotype of the population, and natural selection is the force that causes such a change. So, we're going to today we're going to largely be talking about microevolution. Microevolution are small-scale changes that occur in populations over long periods of time. I think today we'll mostly use an example of cheetahs. And then macroevolution is the evolution of new species. And what we'll be able to demonstrate is that macroevolution is simply a whole lot of microevolution going on in two separate populations. So, a few more definitions. Fitness is the genetic contribution to the next generation. Typically, the way we're going to measure fitness is as the lifetime reproductive success of an individual. So what does that mean? An individual that has 7 offspring has higher fitness than an individual that has 5. You may have oftentimes heard the idea of evolution presented, or natural selection, presented as the concept of survival of the fittest. And that's a little bit of a misnomer. Because the only reason that survival matters is because it allows organisms to reproduce. And what do I mean by that? Let's say you had an individual that was, let's use humans, that was 100 years old and had 2 children. Or you had an individual that was 25 years old and died and had 4 children. Which one of those is more fit? Well, the answer is it's the one that has more children even though they were younger. Survival is only important in so much as it facilitates reproduction. Another thing here, we'll talk about this today, is heritability, and it's the ability for parents to pass their phenotype onto their offspring genetically. You learned a little bit about that last week in genetics. We're going to visit that again. And I've already used this term phenotype, but a phenotype is any measurable quality of an organism. And so what we're going to be talking about today is the evolution of phenotypes that are heritable and therefore have underlying genotypes. Again, all definitions and stuff from last week. Okay, so let's go over these three requirements for evolution by natural selection. I'm throwing in this 4th one of an excess of individuals because it's going to make it a little bit easier for you to understand. And so this first one, excess of individuals, it's an important observation, but let's look at what it means and why it should be important. And we're going to go over these 4 requirements as a series of 4 graphs. Oh, my whiteboard's going a little crazy there. Hopefully that'll ease up. Let's see if I can fix that. All right, there we go. So, in this first graph, I'm going to actually show you population changes over time. And so, we're going to draw a graph here. Here's the x-axis and a y-axis, typical graph. On this axis, I am drawing time. And over here, I'm drawing number of individuals. And one idea that a lot of people think is that if you start with a couple individuals down here, that over time, that population is going to go up and up and up and up. However, that's not totally realistic. And you'll learn about this later in the semester in your chapter on in your session on population ecology. I believe that's 14. And what you'll see is that there's limits to population growth. Populations can't go up and up and up forever. Limiting resources will stop them from going up forever. And so oftentimes the type of shape of growth we get for populations, they go up and up and up, but then they run out of resources and they plateau. And this is something, again, you'll see in session 15, it's called the carrying capacity. But what I want you to think about is how life is at different population sizes. Let's say this was a cheetah population and cheetahs eat gazelles, but there was only enough gazelles to go around to support 100 cheetahs. If this is the case, down here, when you don't have very high populations, life is easy. It's good. It's simple, right? You're a cheetah. There's no other cheetahs trying to eat anything, so you get all the food you want. You're happy. Life is good. You get lots of food. You make lots of babies. However, as the population goes up and up and up, competition for resources increases between individuals. And as you might imagine, right here, when there's just barely enough resources to go around, life kind of stinks. And the reason is competition is so fierce. So only some individuals will be able to get those resources. Some individuals will starve to death. Some individuals will just have enough food to survive, and those lucky ones will be able to get enough food to survive and reproduce. And so this first one, while not really a requirement, is basically pointing out that life is hard. And that because life is hard, there's going to be competition between individuals for survival and reproduction. Let's go ahead and move on. Oop, that was the wrong way to do that. Let's move on to our next one here. And so we kind of went over, it means that there's competition, and it's important because only some individuals survive and reproduce. And we showed you these graphs, and some individuals must survive, some must die. Competition, we already said that. All right, variation in phenotypes. This is going to be our first real requirement for evolution via natural selection. And if you recall, we kind of already talked about what a phenotype is. It's an observable characteristic of an organism. But what I want to do here for a second is let's take a look at a graph, and let's get away from cheetahs for just a second, and let's talk about this in terms of, I'm going to switch up my markers here. This one seems to be dying. And let's talk about this in terms of human populations. What I'm going to do on this graph, that marker is also not working very well. There we go. Is we're going to look at the height of people. And there are short people and there are tall people in the world. And there's different numbers of short, average, and tall people. And if you think about it, you think about how many people you know that are super tall NBA players. This is number of individuals over here. What we would see is that we know very few people who are super tall NBA players, right? We also know very few people who are super, super, super short. But for most people we know are probably average. And some people are a little bit taller than average, and some people are a bit shorter than average, but not super short. And what this ends up looking like is a normal distribution. And this is what variation in phenotypes means. It means in a population, the number of individuals of a given phenotype varies. And in this case, we have a very low number of short people, a very low number of tall people, but a whole lot of people that are about average. And so you can see that in humans. So now all we have to do to change this to cheetah running speed is you could say that we got our population of cheetahs. You can imagine there's variability in running speed, right? Instead of this being human height, now it's running speed. And we have slow and fast. And so some cheetahs are slow, super slow. Some cheetahs are super fast, but most cheetahs are about average. And so we can see that both these things so far are just truisms of the world, right? There's competition between individuals, and there's variation in phenotypes. And this is going to be important because it's going to provide natural selection with something to act on. And so here's what we showed you here. Basically that same graph. It's a histogram, just what I've demonstrated to you before. And it's important because individuals are different, and this will allow selection something to act on. Okay. Now let's move on to our second one, that's phenotype being correlated with fitness. So if you recall, fitness is a measure of an organism's reproductive success. And if an organism has greater reproductive success, they have greater fitness. But our phenotype, that variation or differences between individuals, may be correlated with that fitness. And so we can look at this graphically just like we did our last thing. Let's go ahead, we'll make our next graph down here. And what I'm going to show you is, on this axis, we are placing the running speed of our cheetahs again. We've got slow cheetahs to fast cheetahs. And over here, I want to put fitness. So number of babies they make in their lifetime. 0 to some large number. And you guys kind of intuitively know how this might go. How fit do you think a slow cheetah is going to be? Well, it's not going to be very fit, right? A slow cheetah is going to have trouble catching gazelles. It's not going to be able to feed itself, and it's probably not even going to be able to reproduce. So a slow cheetah would have low fitness. But now think about a super fast cheetah, right? A super fast cheetah may be able to do a great job of catching gazelles and do a super job and therefore have tons of resources and be able to reproduce really well. And an average cheetah might just do about okay. And so we can see an instance here where a phenotype of running speed for the cheetahs is correlated with the fitness of those cheetahs. And so this is our second requirement, that phenotype is somehow related to fitness. Let's go ahead and move on to our next one. We drew you this graph right here. And basically it's important because individuals, as we mentioned, with a certain phenotype may be more fit. All right, now we're on to heritability, something you covered last week. And heritability is simply the ability of parents to genetically pass a trait on to their offspring. And so I'm going to draw you another graph here, and this is called a mid-parent offspring regression. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take we're going to have two cheetahs they breed, and we're going to take their average running speed. So this is parental average running speed, and that can be slow to fast. And then we can have their offspring, or their children, off running speed from slow to fast. Okay. And so basically what we're saying is if we went out and measured the running speed of cheetahs, and then we later went out and measured the running speed of their children, how would the running speed of the parents and the children be related? Well, if this is a genetic trait, we can expect that the running speed, when parents are slow, that their children will be slow, because they'll pass on the genes for running slow. But we can also expect that if parents are fast, that their offspring would be fast, if this is a genetic trait. And lastly, the ones in the middle might be about average speed. And so we get something like this. And of course, we all can recognize that this isn't necessarily always going to be a perfect line, right? There's going to be variation around here. There's going to be variation due to crossing over, like you learned about in genetics, and there's also going to be environmental variance, right? Let's say these cheetahs can run really fast, but they don't do a good job of feeding their kids because they eat all the food themselves. That one might be a little slower. So typically, we'll have variation even around any genetic correlation due to randomization because of sexual reproduction and crossing over, as well as due to the environment. However, even with that variation, what we have is the ability for parents to pass on their traits to their offspring. And so what that means is that offspring will look like their parents. And so we showed you this graph here. And offspring will resemble their parents because of shared genetics. It's important that these are genetic traits because you cannot pass on a trait unless it's genetically based. All right. So now let's link all these things together. we've got a world that's hard and there's lots of competition. In that world that's hard and there's lots of competition, we have individuals of different running speeds, from slow to fast. Fast individuals tend to have great reproductive success. Slow individuals have low reproductive success, or low fitness. And when these individuals do have reproductive success, fast individuals make fast babies, and slow individuals make slow babies because of the genetic component. And so, basically, what happens when some certain phenotype is better than another? Well, we're going to go back to this normal distribution before. And right now, we have some average cheetah running speed. But what's going to happen is that slow cheetahs, how are they going to fare, right? We already said slow cheetahs have low fitness, and so these guys are not going to do a good job of surviving and reproducing. When we have fast ones, though, these ones are going to do a great job of surviving and reproducing. And if this is a genetic trait where, say, there's fast alleles and slow alleles, so not fast, we would expect that as these guys did not reproduce, their slow alleles would be removed from the population. And as these fast ones did reproduce, more and more of their fast alleles would be added to the population. And so over time, as we got more fast alleles, what we would expect to happen is this to shift to the right. And let's draw this in maybe a different color to make it easier to see this shift, where the population, through a change in gene frequency, through natural selection, has gone from being a certain running speed to now a faster one. And it's simply a consequence of those 4 requirements that we outlined before. And so that's really at the heart of what evolution by natural selection really is. And so what happens when a certain phenotype is better than another? Well, it will become more common in the population. The genes that code for that phenotype will become more common. And so natural selection is basically the differential fitness of genotypes that acts on phenotypes caused by factors in the environment. And it causes changes in the gene pools of populations and therefore phenotype over time. And you could tell this exact story that we just told here for cheetah running speed for lots of different things. You could tell a very similar story for something like eagle eyes, right? Which eagles have the best survival and reproduction? Well, those that had really good eyes survived and reproduced. Those that had poor eyes did not. And so there became more and more good eye genes in the population, and now eagles have amazing eyes. Long fur, same thing. Imagine that there were foxes in the foxes like red, that have, red coloring, white tail tip around here. And let's imagine that those foxes were now in the Arctic. Well, you could imagine that those foxes that were slightly lighter in color and had more fur would be able to survive better because they'd be warmer and camouflaged by the snow. And we could even see 2 traits evolving in response to that. And that's how we actually did go from the foxes that we know today to Arctic foxes. Always keep in mind that only the traits with heritable variation will change through evolution. So if it's a trait determined by the environment, it will not be passed on. And if we have time, we're going to address that point a little bit later in the lecture. All right. So there we were talking about microevolution. Now let's take this one step further and talk about it in terms of macroevolution, in terms of new species coming about. And so, really, all macroevolution is a whole lot of evolution of microevolution in 2 separate populations. Okay? And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove our series of things. Well, actually, let's keep it here. I think I've got enough space on the board over here to do this. Let's imagine that you have, let's stick with our foxes, that you had a population of foxes on an island. And these are pretty regular-looking foxes. So they've got their legs, their head, and their tail. Pretty basic-looking fox. But now let's imagine that these foxes were separated and blown to and got to two different other islands. Now we've got a population over here and a population over here. But these islands are very different. On this island, there's lots of big things that could eat foxes. But fortunately, there's also a lot of nice little crevices and rocks that small organisms could hide in to avoid the big predators. And so what we might expect to happen here is that we get the evolution of little microfoxes that can hide inside those crevices. Now let's go to the second island, and let's say that on this island there aren't any predators, but what there are is lots of big yummy things to eat. Things like cows and deer, but they're huge. And so smaller foxes would have trouble eating them, but bigger foxes would do better. Well, what we might expect to happen over here is the evolution of giant foxes that look like monsters with sharp, pointy teeth. Something like that. And so this is all going on, lots of microevolution to change the foxes over millions of years. But now let's say that we get these two populations together. This big giant fox over here encounters this little one, and the question is, are they going to mate? And the answer is probably not, right? This one, the big one's probably going to look at this one and say, oh my gosh, that's food for me, and want to eat it. Not mate with it. And that's where speciation has occurred. When sexually reproducing organisms are separated and have enough changes in their genotypes and phenotypes that they can no longer interbreed with each other, we then consider them separate species. And so I gave you an example with these two over here, these two populations, to show you a dramatic difference. But you can imagine that even you wouldn't have needed one of these. If this one evolved to be this big giant predator over here, it's probably not going to mate with the regular fox that came from over here either. And so that's what macroevolution is. Lots of these accumulated changes over time such that species can no longer breed with each other. And it basically takes into account all of these things just happening with a lot of different traits over a really long time such that incredible amounts of differences occur. And so if they become genetically isolated because they can't mate, they are a new species. And that's kind of tying everything together that we talked about there. Okay. And we gave you that island example. So now we're going to move on to, with the rest of our time here, to some extra related topics in evolution. So this was all about evolution by natural selection, but we can also talk about other forces in evolution. We're going to talk about mutation, we're going to talk about random genetic drift, we're going to talk about gene flow, and then we'll talk about sexual and artificial selection as well. Mutations, as we learned in the previous weeks, are simply errors caused by, errors in genetics. Let's keep it easy. And if you recall as well, most all mutations are deleterious. They're going to cause problems for an organism. And most of the time, these changes are very small. But what's important is that mutations create new genotypes for selection to act on, and they maintain variation in a population. So what we mean by that is that if we look down here, let's go back to this graph over here, where we had our slow and our fast cheetahs. Let's kind of clear up some of our space on the board. And we're going to draw a new one so that we can see it better. And this is still cheetahs. Let's still talk about cheetahs. There are still slow cheetahs and fast cheetahs, and we still have this distribution like that. Okay? Well, something you may have noticed is that we were talking about this in the change as a function of changes in allele frequencies. And as time went on, we were getting more and more fast alleles and fewer short alleles. But eventually we're going to reach what's called fixation. And what this is it's where you would expect these guys to keep evolving until everybody was fast and everybody only had fast genes. And so what that's going to do is it's going to take our population and it is going to make it look like this instead. Every cheetah's fast and there's only the fast gene in them. If you want to think about a trait that's fixed, think about something like number of heads in people, right? There's no variation for that trait. Everybody has the exact same genes that say make one head. But why can't cheetahs be faster? Right? We know cheetahs got really fast. And the thing is here is let's say there's a mutation. And let's say that mutation makes the cheetah ever so slightly slower. But what's going to happen to that mutation? Remember, slow cheetahs don't have as good survival and reproduction. So that's gone. That mutation, most mutations will be bad and cause that to happen. But let's say there's a good mutation. Let's say that that mutation enables cheetahs to be even faster than they were before. So here, before was our fastest cheetah, but now we can get even faster. Well, if that's the case, we're going to have a new speed that's faster over here. And even if we have a regular fast allele, and now we get a new allele that's a super fast allele, and this one has 99%, and this one has 1% of the alleles in the population, that 1% is going to increase, right? Because that cheetah is faster. And so what's going to happen is now that we've had a mutation, we can actually see a shift to getting even faster. And so that was an example where it was a shift of the same trait just extending. But you can get whole new plates, or whole new traits. Let's imagine like plates on a lizard, okay? And so imagine you've got a lizard, and that lizard has scales. Can you imagine that a lizard that got slightly thicker scales might be safer from predators because they couldn't chomp down on them as well? Yeah, of course. That's a very small change, but it's a qualitative difference. We went from scales to thicker scales. I'm sorry, it's going to eventually become a qualitative difference. That's just quantitative. We just went there. But then you can imagine that if they got thicker, those scales became thicker and got a little bumped. Then they're going to be even bigger advantage. And eventually, maybe they develop a point on that bump. And maybe eventually they turn into spikes. And we can go from something that didn't exist before, there were not any spikes, to spikes through all these small changes along the way. And it may not look like much is happening over the millions of years that occurs. But when it's done, you have some lizard, you have this new lizard that has spikes. So that is where mutations come into play. They create new variation, new genotypes, which code for new phenotypes that selection can act on. Another type of force in evolution is random genetic drift. And we've been talking about natural selection so far, which is causing things to directionally change. It's causing them to go to one extreme of a phenotype. Random genetic drift is just due to random changes. And this figure from your book shows this pretty well. And the idea here is that in large populations, random genetic drift doesn't matter very much. But imagine you had a small population. And imagine in that small population we've got regular penguins and red penguins. Well, due to just a random chance, maybe the red penguin doesn't survive. Maybe it gets struck by lightning or something like that. If that happens, that can be a change in the allele frequency in the population. Populations always have a little bit of evolution going on because of slight shifts in gene frequencies or allele frequencies because of this random genetic drift. And so it's really not a very moving force in evolution, but it can sometimes cause changes by removing certain genotypes in small populations. Gene flow is another pretty easy one to understand. This one is also not something that's necessarily going to be always adaptive. In fact, sometimes it can be maladaptive. And in this case, imagine there were red birds on this island and yellow birds on this island. And if some yellow birds went to the red bird island and bred there, what would happen is they would bring their yellow alleles with them. And that would have caused a genetic change, a change in the allele frequencies in this population Where before it was red, now it's becoming slightly more yellow, so maybe a little bit more orange, simply because of that introduction of genetic material from another population. And so that's what gene flow is. We already talked about some types of selection. We've been talking about natural selection the whole time. There is also sexual and artificial selection. Looks like there's a typo there. Mate choice is what sexual selection is. Really, it's just a form of natural selection where mate choice is what's driving it. If you remember earlier in the semester in your hypothesis lab, we talked about red cardinals. And in the example of cardinals, you started off with cardinals that were brownish, but females preferred to mate with the red ones. And so because red cardinals had greater reproductive success, the population shifted toward male cardinals that were red. And so this can also occur with something like mate competition, like deer budding antlers for the right to mate with a female, right? That's why deer evolved antlers. Those that had bigger antlers were better able to make offspring. Artificial selection gives us our ability to make large-scale changes over short periods of time. And here's why. I've been showing you this graph over here saying, these guys never reproduce, these guys always reproduce, and so the population shifts that way. But that's not always how it is. Because, sometimes a slow cheetah has a good year, sometimes a fast cheetah has a bad year, and sometimes everything in between has differential survival and reproduction. And that's one of these reasons that the changes take place slowly. But what if I could pick the exact individuals that I wanted to survive and reproduce? And I could take one, and I could take two, and I could breed them, and they were always the extremes. So in this case, if it's cheetahs, I just take the fastest ones. Well, what I can do is I can get evolution to move very rapidly through that means. For instance, corn. Corn, if you can, you'll be able to see this. Corn used to be about this big with about 10 kernels that look like this. Over the past 10,000 years through humans' agricultural history, we've managed to take corn from looking like that to being something like that, with many, many kernels. That's a lot of change over 5,000 or 10,000 years. And the same thing goes for dogs, right? How do we get so many different dogs? The domestication of wolves really started getting serious about 10,000 years ago. Breeding of different breeds started getting really serious about 5,000 years ago. And so what we see, look at all the diversity of dogs you see today. Those were all wolves 5,000 years ago. And what we've done is through selective breeding, through choosing those that we wanted to breed, we've ended up getting all these varieties of dogs. And so artificial selection is induced by humans and causes dramatic changes over short periods of time. Now we're going to take a moment to talk about modes of selection. Directional, we've already talked about a lot. You guys have seen that. This has been our example of a shifting phenotype the whole time. Disruptive is simply when two extremes of the phenotype are the best and it drives the population apart. And so let's say a classic example is, I think, what does your book use? I'm trying to remember. What does your book use for disruptive selection? Well, I can just make up one. Basically what you end up with is that, let's say that there was an advantage toward being, this was color, so white to black, and there were great places for white organisms to hide and black organisms to hide, but being gray meant you were visible in both instances. You could actually see selection favoring the two extreme phenotypes rather than the middle. Disruptive selection is very infrequent, which is why it's even hard to come up with an example of it. But here's an interesting one, stabilizing selection. And the fact is, I didn't tell you one of the secrets of what's going on over here. Because if you've noticed, if directional selection kept going on forever, what you would expect to happen is to have cheetahs that were as fast as rocket ships, right? If being faster is better, you're cheetahs zooming around everywhere. But they don't. And the reason is because of trade-offs in living organisms. And let's for a moment imagine that cheetahs were getting faster by making their legs longer. And that's partially true. If you look at the body size relative to leg length of a cheetah, and compare it to other big cats, cheetahs have relatively long legs. So if you're getting faster by making your legs longer, you can march toward being faster. But can you imagine how at some point there's a disadvantage to having really long legs? Because maybe those legs are prone to breaking, right? You can imagine some sort of cheetah that look kind of crazy with really long legs like this, right? This cheetah's not doing very much. And so, while there's selective force this way to get faster, there's also selective force this way to help the cheetah avoid breaking its legs. And so, maybe in years where competition is really severe, you end up with cheetahs that are faster doing the best. But in years where there's lots of food around and stuff like that, there's going to be selective pressure to have shorter legs. These things are easy to catch, and legs are easy to break when they're long. And so what this does is it applies two forces from each direction to produce the optimal trait value. And so when we look at organisms that have evolved in a certain environment for a long period of time, they have typically settled on an optimal trait value for their environment. And so in this case, cheetahs are a certain running speed because constraints of being any faster push them back toward that super fast speed. We can use another example of this with deer, let's say. So deer antlers are a certain size, right? Well, deer with larger antlers have better reproductive success. It'd be easy to think, right away, well, those deer with giant antlers are going to mate more, so deer should have the biggest antlers possible. But you can imagine if those antlers got so big that deer's like dragging its head around like this, and it can't fit through the woods and stuff like that, that would be bad. So selection pushes those male deer to the optimal antler size for their body size. And so I think with that, we are kind of out of time here for the lecture portion. And so what I can do at this point is take any questions if you guys have them. I noticed a couple people here came in late. I'll go ahead and enable your microphones. So do you guys have any questions? I don't think I'm hearing any. So there's also one person who only has a keyboard, so I'll give you, if you want to ask a question or type one, go ahead now. Otherwise, we will call it a wrap for today. There will be a video of this posted online. You can email me if you want that link. I think in the next presentation, I'll start out the video with that link because students asked about that right away. All right, so I'm not hearing any questions. So I hope that was helpful for you guys, and I will see you next week, or you can always watch these online as well, whichever you prefer. So thank you for attending.
Thank you. Nice job.
Okay, I hope that helped you out.